Hi everyone, welcome to this recorded session. This is the fourth session that I've done for the group, which is about building interactivity and looking specifically at talk for learning. So let's have a look at what we're planning to go through. So in this session, we're going to think about the balance of talk in the classroom. We're going to think about who does the most talking, what the kind of balance might be between the teacher and the students. We'll have a little look at some of the research. In particular, we're going to look at Vygotsky and what he was talking about, because it's very relevant to thinking about talking in the classroom and those interaction patterns and dynamics of social learning. And we'll also think about ways of promoting talk for learning. So what can we do to make sure that talk actually happens in the classroom? The talk for learning, not just chitter-chatter, like talk for learning. Please do have a pen and a notebook handy. There are various moments during the recording where you might want to pause and make a note of some ideas. You know, I might ask some questions and you want to have a think about that. So do use the pause button and write down ideas and then press play again to continue watching the recording. So we're going to start off with a question. We'll start off with a question of why do students need to talk? Why is it important for their learning that they talk? And again, I'll reinforce the point that we're not just talking about talking between themselves, catching up on what happened at the weekend or on their favourite series on the TV and things like that. We're talking about learning itself, the concepts that they're studying and the concepts that they're learning about. So talk is a part of human development that helps us to think, it helps us to learn, and it helps us to make sense of the world. So people use language as a tool for developing reasoning, knowledge, and understanding, and therefore encouraging students to talk as part of their learning experiences will mean that their educational progress is enhanced. So what we're saying there is that in order to be able to learn, students have to put things into words. They have to try and explain things. Language and thinking are linked, and it's only when we try and put words to concepts that we can actually really understand them deeply. Okay, so the idea or the activity of giving them an opportunity to talk about what they're learning is essential if we want any kind of deep learning to take place. Otherwise, it's only superficial learning. They don't really understand the concepts as well as they should. And it means that, you know, a month or two later, they'll have forgotten everything that you did in the classroom with them. In order to make sure that that learning actually takes place, they need opportunities to talk about it. Whether or not they talk about it and make mistakes or have misconceptions, it's that process of trying to put it into words that will help them to iron out those doubts or see where, you know, perhaps they haven't understood something clearly, or for the teacher to see that as well. So it's an important thing, an important question to ask yourself as a teacher then is who is talking in the classroom. On the one hand, teacher talk, so when the teacher is explaining things or talking to the learners, it's an important aspect of learning because teachers model spoken language and they also recast phrases back to children in a correct way. So grammatically correct or maybe conceptually correct, right? So have that in mind. If you're teaching a subject bilingually, then you're thinking about both aspects, like the grammar and the structure of the language, but also the concepts that the learners are trying to explain. So when students put things into words, the teacher might echo those things back. So the teacher's talk acts as a model for student learning and for student thinking. Like the teacher can model thinking processes out loud to the learners as well, asking themselves questions and answering those questions. But on the other hand, if the teacher talks all of the time, then the students don't have any opportunities to try and put their understanding into words, and that's very key. So obviously the teacher has to do some talking, the teacher has to explain concepts, the teacher has to clarify, the teacher has to recast ideas for the learners to be able to progress. But if the teacher is the only one who's talking in the lesson, then the students aren't really learning anything. The teacher has to allow time for student talk too. In a bilingual classroom, some of that student talk might happen in the L1 instead of in the L2. But that's important to the learner's process. So we shouldn't say, no, 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 if you don't say it in English, you don't say it at all. They need to be able to talk about what they're learning, to try to clarify their understanding and understand it better. And they may not have the language for that, especially at lower levels, in which case some of that talk might happen in their L1. And we need to allow that to happen and look for ways to turn them into learning opportunities by saying, that's an excellent explanation. Let's see if we know how to say it in English. Can anyone help us? And we turn it into a learning opportunity. Okay, so we've got two pictures here. We've got on the left-hand side a traditional classroom with a teacher talking, the students listening, and one student has her hand up to ask a question. On the other side, we've got the other extreme where the teacher and the learners are working together, they're discussing things, they're looking at each other's work, the teacher's asking questions, but the learner is answering those questions, explaining, justifying, and so on. So they're kind of like two extremes on a scale. If imagine that I was to come and walk into your classroom at any given moment, which of those two pictures do you think I would be more likely to see? Would I be more likely to come in and see you standing at the front next to the board and talking, with the students only able to participate if they put their hands up? Or would I see collaborative teacher facilitator type activities with groups and pairs and individual work, but students talking and putting into words what they're learning all the time? Which of those two do you think I'd be more likely to see? Now, I know that at any class will have a combination of both of those things, hopefully, that no class is entirely just collaborative, that there will be moments where the teacher has to explain. We talked about that before. That teacher input is an important part of a lesson too. But the problem is when that's all there is in the lesson, if 100% of the class time is spent like this, then the students are not getting the time that they need to put their learning into words. There's also a problem possibly if 100% of the class time is spent like this all the time. There might be lessons where the students are in the middle of something, they don't need any input, they can just come in and continue where they left off, and you don't need to be at the front of the classroom at all. There might be classes where you have a lot of input to give them, so you stand at the front for one lesson, but then the subsequent 3 lessons are spent working in groups and talking together. Okay, what we're talking about is the balance between those two extremes. We're not talking about that your class should always look like this or always look like that. We're talking about that there should be some kind of balance between them. So I want you to pause the video for a second and just take a few moments to think about your lessons. If you had to say where you were, where would you be? Is it 50% one kind of lesson, 50% the other? Is it more 70% traditional and 30% interactive? Is it the other way around, 70% interactive, 30% traditional? Where are you on there? You know, are you kind of 50-50? Are you leaning towards one way of teaching or towards the other more? Have a moment and think and write down what your answer might be. And then when you're ready, you can press play again. And I'll tell you that the ideal classroom should be 30% the teacher talking, 60% student talk. So you should be leaning more towards the picture on the right. That should be most of the class time. 60% of your class time should look like that. And 30% should look like the teacher on the left-hand side. Okay, just in case you're clear. If your percentages weren't like that, some of the ideas today might help you address that balance and get a clearer kind of equilibrium between those two types of teaching in your classroom. So let's go to the research then. I did promise that we would do some research, and I did say it would only be a little bit. So let's have a look at what Vygotsky said. So Vygotsky doesn't need an introduction from me. He's a very famous researcher that came up with a lot of theories of learning and education, and they're still very, very relevant today. So let's have a look at some of the things that he said that are relevant to this particular topic. So Vygotsky sought to understand how people learn in a social environment and created a unique theory on social learning. So his theory was that learning is a social activity, that we can't do it individually. It has to happen within a group. He determined that teachers have the ability to control many factors in an educational setting, including the tasks, behaviour and responses. And as a result, he encouraged more interactive activities to promote cognitive growth, such as productive discussions, constructive feedback, and collaboration with others. So his theory on learning stated that the more we try to include that kind of student talking to the teacher about, talking to each other about, through discussions, through feedback, through collaboration, the more we can include that, the better the learning will be, the more likely the learners are to be able to move forward in their understanding of the topics. So his points included the argument that language supports other activities such as reading and writing. In addition, he claimed that logic, reasoning, and reflective thinking were all possible as a result of language. So language facilitates thinking processes such as logic, reasoning, reflection. Okay, so if we don't try to explain things, then those thought processes aren't necessarily happening or aren't necessarily completely happening. So this led to the development of instructional strategies to support growth in literacy, as well as a reassessment of the classroom setup. Okay, so he then suggested certain ways that we can, as teachers, we can make sure that that kind of talk for learning is actually taking place in the classroom. Teachers were to encourage leadership in the classroom, collaborative learning, and thoughtful discussions, with the exception of independent tasks, which were also included. So there is a place for independent working, but that doesn't mean that everything should be in pairs or in groups. There is a time and a place where students need to work individually, okay? But perhaps as a follow-on to that, they then work with a partner to explain what they were thinking about. They need to then put whatever they were thinking about individually into words. And now that could be through writing something. When you write something, you're putting your ideas and your thoughts into words as well, not just through speaking, but speaking is an important aspect of that too. The role of the teacher was, with the exception of independent tasks, which were also included, the goal was to create purposeful, meaningful exchanges between students, and the role of the teacher was to facilitate learning. So the teacher is the facilitator by directing the dialogue and confirming contributions. So asking guiding questions, confirming contributions, recasting misconceptions, saying, yes, okay, that's almost right, but actually what it is this. So you engage in a discussion with the learners to help them develop their understanding of the knowledge in an effort to further motivate the students. Okay. So using talk for learning involves planning lessons so that students can talk more and learn more in a way that makes connections with their prior experience. It's much more than a question and answer session between the teacher and the students. Many teachers think that they can stand at the front and ask questions, often closed questions, but sometimes open questions, and have a question and answer session with the whole class, and that way they have included student talk. That's not it at all, because only one or two students are actually thinking about and answering those questions and putting their answers into words. The others aren't participating, or are participating on a very superficial level. And those kind of directed questions and the questions that come only from the teacher are very one-dimensional. They don't go deep enough into the learning. Whereas if you encourage the learners to also ask and answer their own questions to each other and individually, then you'll get a lot more valuable learner talk. We'll look at some strategies for this in a few moments. So it's much more than a question and answer session between the teacher and the students, in that the students' own language, ideas, reasoning, and interests are given more time. Okay, so we need to make it more open, less planned, less closed, more flexible. So we need to plan the lesson around what we want the students to learn and what we want them to think about, as well as what type of talk we want them to develop. So we need to think also about what types of talking we want them to be involved in. Is it a discussion? Is it a debate? And so on. Okay, is it a presentation? Some types of talk are exploratory. They explore ideas. For example, what could happen next? Have we seen this before? What could this be? Or why do you think that is? Okay, so those kinds of questions are very powerful questions. They work extremely well if we do them as a think, pair, share activity. So where we give the learners the question and ask them to think individually, maybe jot down some ideas first individually, and then work with the partner, and then we share our ideas as a whole group. We'll generate a lot more engagement and a lot more answers and a lot deeper thinking if we include those steps, rather than just asking the question and have them put their hands up. Other types of talk are more analytical, for example, weighing up ideas, evidence, or suggestions. So it's very important that we, as teachers, build on students' contributions, that we stop trying to be the expert and guide their thinking, but allow them to let their thinking develop in their own ways. So the best student talk is exploratory, means it explores. Okay, it means that the students explore and challenge one another's ideas so that they can become confident about their responses. Okay, so exploring, asking questions to each other, not to the teacher, or responding to the teacher's questions. Groups talking together should be encouraged not just to accept an answer, whoever gives it. Okay, so challenge, why? What do you think? But why do you say that? Are you sure? And so justify your answer. You can model challenging thinking in a whole class setting through your use of probing questions like why, how did you decide that? Can you see any problems with that solution? And then walk around the classroom listening to groups of students and extending their thinking by asking those questions. So the teacher acts as a model for that kind of probing questioning. But you need to also tell the students and encourage the students that they need to be thinking about that themselves and developing those kinds of questioning techniques themselves. So you could have the questions on the board and tell the students that they should try to pause every 2 to 3 minutes, look at the board and ask some of those questions to each other, not just that the teacher's asking those questions. The students should learn to ask each other those questions. Another important thing to think about is inclusion, of course. You need to be aware that some members of the class might be marginalised, and think about how you can ensure that they're included. They might be marginalised because of learning difficulties, or because they are introverts, not extroverts, because they don't fit in with the other students in the class in some way. And we need to make sure that they're included. So having the teacher at the front asking questions and the learners putting their hands up, you get a lot of participation from a certain group of students, usually the ones in the front, usually the ones who are extroverts, and usually the ones who don't have learning difficulties will be keen to put up their hands to show what they know. They're confident, they don't have any problem with understanding the content. But you get a lot of students who don't participate in those situations because it's threatening, because they don't feel confident in their ideas. They don't want to say it in front of the class in case the class laughs at them. And the class might not laugh at them, but that's how they feel. So we have to give that some space and think about how we can help them to contribute in those situations as well. So those kind of teacher answer sessions with the whole class, for me, are not very effective ways of making sure that the whole class is involved and learning. So it may take some time to establish ways of working that allow all the students to participate fully. So experiment with different ideas of interaction patterns, think, pair, share, collaborative group tasks, and so on, to see what the best thing is with your particular group of students or groups of students. Different things might work better with different groups, for example. And most importantly of all, we need to encourage the students to ask questions. So we said before that the teacher needs to model some of that probing questioning, but our mission as teachers is to get the students asking more questions. Okay, so we could plan some regular group or pair work in which they use those probing questions that we looked at before. Or perhaps we could have a student question time so that students can raise queries or ask for clarification. You could entitle a section of your lesson, hands up if you have a question, put a student in the hot seat and encourage other students to question that student as if they were a character from a book that you're working on in literacy, for example. Hot seat means that you put a chair in front of the board in front of all the other students, usually where the teacher sits, right? And one student sits on that chair. It's kind of a very intimidating place to sit, and the others ask questions to that student, but that student is not themselves. They're imagining themselves in a different role. You could play a tell me more game, where for everything that the students say, their partner replies, tell me more about that. Or you could give students a question grid, and we'll see an example of one of these in a second, with who, what, where, and why questions to practice basic inquiry. So you say, talk about, here's something, an issue that you need to talk about what happens in the chapter, but I want you to each ask 3 questions using the question grid to the other students and explore the ideas in more depth. Give the students some data, such as the data available from the World Data Bank. For example, the percentage of children in full-time education or exclusive breastfeeding rates for different countries, or whatever. Depending on the topics and themes that you're working on in the book that you're working with, there'll be topics and themes. So I know that one group is working on the boy in the striped pajamas. Can you find some data on the Holocaust or on persecution that happens nowadays? Other groups might be working on books that are set in certain geographical locations. Can you find some statistical data about those places that might help you understand some of the things that are happening in the books? There's another group working on a book written by an autistic girl about her experience of starting secondary school, which is called Can You See Me? Can you find statistics on autism? Especially autism in girls. I think it's not as common as it is in boys. Could you find some statistics that somehow relate to some of the things that you're working on in the book, and get the students in your class to explore those statistics through questioning and wondering about things and supposing things and applying, linking those to the statistics with the concepts that they're working on through the book. You can also design a question wall listing the students' questions of the week. So at the end of each lesson, I like to hand out post-it notes and ask my students to write down any questions that they have, and we put them on the question wall. And then at the end of the week, we go through the questions and see which ones we can answer. If we can answer them, we move them to a different space on the classroom wall. So these are the questions we can't answer yet. These are the questions we can now answer, and on a different coloured post-it note, we can write out the answer to the question and stick it next to the original question. Some of the questions might not have specific answers, in which case we can put them on a different area of the classroom, which is called the I wonder questions. I don't know. You deal with it however you see fit, but using the space on the classroom walls to generate questions and for the students to see that, okay, here are our questions, here is what we're doing with them once we know the answers to them, and so on. So I just mentioned a question matrix. Here is an example of a question matrix that you could give to your students. So you could give them this matrix and ask them to come up with 3 questions. Or you could say, okay, this group, I want you to come up with 3 what questions, or 3 when questions, or 3 questions about possibility related to what we're talking about, or opinion, okay? Or 3 random questions, or 5, or 10, or whatever you want to do, okay? This helps the students to come up with the questions, especially when this is something that's new to them. So I really would recommend using something like this to help them generate questions. You should be able to get a copy of the PowerPoint, but if not, you can also take a screenshot of this question matrix, or even just Google question matrix, and you'll find lots of examples. This is from Teacher Toolkit, if you're looking for it. And we also need to think about supporting talk. So it's one thing is to set up opportunities for talk, but we need to actually support that in the classroom, linguistically, but also in terms of the fact that they're not used to necessarily doing this kind of thing. So this is something that we want to push, something that we want to promote. So a good place to start with talk habits is to ensure that the students know how to speak and that they know how to listen. We need to make our instructions explicit and ensure that we communicate these simply and clearly. We should demonstrate and model talking and questioning as much as we can. We said that earlier. Something as straightforward as stating that the students should respond in full sentences significantly increases the impact of a talk task. So always insisting on full sentences in the class, especially as you get to the higher levels of secondary, but in first of ESOL also, they should be responding in full sentences as much as possible. And if they say, I don't know how to do it, you say, that's fine, no problem, I'll help you. What do you want to say? Okay. Can anybody else help us to make this into a full sentence? Okay. And encourage it and insist on it. So not only does it emulate the metacognitive function of formulating an answer, it also ensures that learners to begin to associate their talk with their writing. So that full sentences idea helps them process ideas metacognitively more deeply. And it will also help them develop their written skills if you always ask them to answer in full sentences. So definitely, if there's one change that you make in your classroom, that's the change that you need to make. And then we need to think about scaffolding. Scaffolding is the support structure that we use to support a building that's not quite complete. And if we think about the metaphor of scaffolding in the classroom, the building that's not quite complete is the learner's understanding or knowledge of the topic or theme that we're working on. And our scaffolding helps support that as they build their knowledge, okay? So it's support, any kind of support that the teacher can give. And that could be linguistic support, but it also could be conceptual support, okay? Because there might be ideas that are new to them or concepts that are new to them that they're trying to get their head around. So providing simple scaffolding for students to support their talk can make discussions and presentation of responses in class more effective. Scaffolding needs to be a key part of any talk task, especially after so much disruption and time away from the classroom. Okay, students are not used to, well, they're getting better at being in the classroom with each other, but they've had a lot of disruption, and that's affecting how well they perform in the kind of typical classroom tasks that maybe they did better on beforehand. Now it's a little bit more complicated. As always, low cognitive load and consistency are two important ingredients. So try not to make things too cognitively challenging and try to be consistent. But apart from that, anything goes. It might be phrase starters, so the beginning of a sentence that they then complete the sentence. Questions, we looked at some ideas of questions before. Help with turn taking. And one very effective way to get them to take turns is to pass a ball or pass a pen or pass a microphone. When they're working in groups, you pass it round. And only the person who's holding that can actually speak, and the others have to listen. And if they want to ask a question, they need to take the pen or take the ball or take the microphone or whatever it happens to be. Anything. So over time, these scaffolded resources can be scaled back, so eventually the learned behaviours become habits. So you don't need to have a ball or a microphone or a pen to show turn taking all the time, as they gradually learn about turn taking and how to wait until someone's finished talking before they ask a question. You can gradually remove those kinds of scaffolds that you're using. And the phrase starters, once they start to be able to formulate complete sentences for every response, then you don't need to give them phrase starters to help them with that. Mistakes and errors is another important thing to be thinking about. Students should feel comfortable to make mistakes. They should feel comfortable to not have understood a concept and to be able to put that into words so that they can have the concept explained to them again so that they can learn it, right? A culture of error is an environment where individuals feel safe making and discussing mistakes. So you can spend less time hunting for errors and more time fixing them. And that comes from Doug Lemoff, who in an article called Teach Like a Champion, you can Google that if you want to read more. So by building in this openness, teachers are able to show students that getting things wrong is not a problem, it's actually an opportunity. This is something that's very, very important to explain to them. Something that you can actually even model as a teacher yourself. If you're a non-native speaker of English, one very easy way to do that is when the students ask, do I say it like this or do I say it like that, is admit that you don't know and show them how a resourceful learner of language finds out. Use Google or use a dictionary, okay, and say, I'm learning the language too. Everybody's learning something. And or concept questions that I'm not sure about that. What do you think? What do you think? A high-performing classroom respects error, normalizes it, and values learning from it. So thank the learners who've made mistakes. Thank you for that. We've learned a lot more because you told us what you were thinking. generate a culture of celebration of errors and mistakes. And by building this culture, students are much more willing to engage and to speak up. So if it doesn't matter, if they don't feel bad when they make a mistake, then they'll be very happy to engage much more and put into words what they're thinking much more. So it's very, very important to establish this. So we've come to the end of the session. I hope there's been some interesting ideas there for you, things that you can apply and try in the classroom. What I'd like you to do once you finish watching the video is to just take a couple of moments to think back through all the things that I've been talking about and write down your 3 most important takeaways from the session. What 3 things do you want to change, or did you learn, or surprised you, or whatever? What 3 things will you remember from this session that you'll take away from this session that will change your teaching or have some effect on the way that you work in the future? Okay, so that's your homework for after watching this recording. Have a look at, think about your takeaways. And I'd just like to say thank you very much for watching the recording, and I hope that that you learned something from it, or it was useful for you, and that you're planning to make some changes to your teaching as a result of some of the things that we've been looking at today. If you're interested in finding out more, you can Google Talk for Learning, and you'll come up with lots of articles that explore in more depth some of the things that we've been talking about today. So thank you for watching, and hope to see you in another recording sometime soon.